I am going to explain how record sales and royalties typically work in a record deal, as well as 9 provisions that artists seeking to sign a record deal should understand. These 9 provisions were, at one time or another, fairly commonplace in record deals. Some of these provisions are still commonplace and very relevant. Some of these provisions are either no longer commonplace, or even if they are no longer very relevant since the music industry has largely moved from physical record sales to digital streams. I have read multiple music contracts going as far back as 1940. That 1940 contract was between a country artist and a record company that today is owned by a major record company. It was a deal for one album, and the artist would receive a single-digit royalty percentage and a $25 advance. The worst music contract that I've read was probably one between an artist and an independent record label from the 2010s. The second worst was probably a K-pop contract from the 2000s. Bad music contracts are not limited to the 20th century, nor are they limited to major record labels, nor are they limited to the US. One reason recording contracts are often lopsided in favor of the record label is information asymmetry. A record label may see multiple recording contracts and understand them better than many of the artists they negotiate with, who, in a lot of cases, are looking at their first recording contract and may not understand a problematic provision well enough to recognize the issue with it. A second reason recording contracts are often lopsided is that prior to the digital age, the cost of recording, pressing, distribution, and marketing made record labels important gatekeepers to hits, which gave them lots of leverage in record deal negotiations. These factors contributed to a status quo in recording contracts which, though improved in many ways, is still heavily tilted in favor of record labels. The information asymmetry is what my TikTok page and books are intended to address. Here's an overview of how record sales and royalties typically worked in a record deal. For physical record sales, a record label would typically partner with a distributor who would sell their records wholesale to various retailers. The retailer would then set the retail price charged to consumers. Taxes aside, if a consumer bought a record at retail, then the retailer would keep the difference between the retail price and the wholesale price. The wholesale price would consist of a master royalty portion, typically divided between the distributor, record label, and artist, and a publishing royalty portion, typically divided between the songwriters and music publishers. An artist royalty is essentially a percentage applied to a dollar amount. For each album, a recording contract may grant an artist a percentage known as the basic rate and a dollar amount known as the base price. These are essentially a reference percentage and a reference dollar amount. The basic rate and/or the base price may be subject to various deductions. In major label record deals, the basic rate was often 12 to 20%. For superstar artists or artists signed to indie record labels, the numbers might be higher, or the royalties may be based on a profit share or net proceeds model. In multi-album record deals, the basic rate would often increase by 1 point for each subsequent album of the deal, or for every other album of the deal. The base price for physical record sales was not typically the retail price. It was typically either the PPD, a constructed retail price, or the SRLP. The PPD is the published price to dealer and is basically the wholesale price. In some cases, PPD may be defined as the highest price charged to a retailer that sells directly to consumers. In that case, PPD may be viewed as the highest published wholesale price. The constructed retail price is a wholesale price uplifted by a certain amount. The constructed retail price was often around 130% of either the wholesale price or the lowest published wholesale price. SRLP is the suggested retail list price, which is basically the manufacturer's suggested retail price. It was often higher than a constructed retail price would be. However, it was also typically accompanied by a container charge. Records that were sold at wholesale but went unsold at retail could often be returned by the retailer to the distributor for a refund or for credit towards future purchases. Because of the potential for such returns, the record label would typically hold a percentage of the artist's royalties in reserve for a couple of months to a couple of years. In contract negotiations, an artist would want the reserve percentage to be low and to be paid out quickly. An artist's royalty would ultimately be based on records that were sold at wholesale and not returned by the retailer. Though if a record was sold at a significant wholesale discount, then the artist might receive a reduced royalty or potentially no royalty for that sale. For digital record sales and streams, the artist would typically receive a percentage of the net receipts, which is what the record label received from the distributor, minus some additional costs such as union costs and mechanical royalties. In a lot of record deals, the artist's master royalty is typically considered all in, meaning that master royalties or other master side payments made to music producers or audio engineers would come out of the artist's share of master royalties, not the record label's share. For example, if the all-in royalty was 18% and the artist collaborates with a music producer that receives 4 points on the master, then the artist's share would drop to 14%. A physical record sold in the U.S. through normal retail channels, such as a big box retailer, is often considered a U.S. NRC sale. If an album's U.S. NRC sales exceed certain thresholds, such as 500,000 U.S. NRC sales or 1 million U.S. NRC sales, then the basic rate for subsequent sales of that album may increase by 0.5 to 1%. If a physical record was sold outside of the U.S., the sale would no longer be U.S. NRC, and the artist might receive a reduced royalty rate for that sale. For example, an artist might receive 85 to 90% of the basic rate for records sold in Canada, 80 to 85% for records sold in the UK, Japan, and Australia, 75% for records sold in the rest of Western Europe and in Scandinavia, and 60 to 66 and 2/3% for records sold in the rest of the world. An artist might also receive a reduced royalty rate for physical records sold through non-normal retail channels such as a mom-and-pop record store. Record labels may price different records at different prices. A physical record sale may be classified as top line, midline, or budget based on its PPD or SRLP. Sales that were considered top line would not result in a price line royalty deduction. A sale might be considered midline if its PPD or SRLP is around 65 to 80% of top line. The artist's royalty may only be 66 and 2/3 to 75% of the basic rate. A sale might be considered budget if its PPD or SRLP is below the low end of midline. The artist's royalty may only be 50% of the basic rate. However, if the PPD or SRLP is less than 50% of top line, or if the record was given away for free, then the artist might receive no royalties for that record. An important note for midline and budget records is that not only would the artist be receiving a lower royalty percentage than top line, that percentage would also be applied to a lower price than top line. Prior to the mid-2000s, artist royalties were typically based on SRLP. That, combined with an artist not typically receiving royalties for records given away for free, meant that a record label may increase their share of the revenue by charging retailers more for records and compensating them with free ones. Instead of a record label selling a retailer 100 records for $8.50 each, the record label may sell them 85 records for $10 each and then give them 15 records for free. The retailer would still get 100 records, the record label would still get $850, but the artist would be owed royalties on 85 records instead of 100. Because the artist's royalty was based on SRLP rather than PPD or the actual retail price, the artist wouldn't benefit from the higher price of those 85 sold records. This type of practice became fairly common in the music industry. Artists were eventually successful in pushing back against this, and record labels largely moved to PPD-based royalties. But some record labels started pushing clauses which allowed them to only pay royalties for 85% of records sold. Around 1895, the music industry began to move from making records out of wax to making them out of shellac. Shellac records were less likely to warp due to temperature changes, but they were also pretty brittle. So to make up for records that may have broken, record labels started paying artists royalties for 90% of net sales instead of 100%. Records made of the much stronger polyvinyl chloride, aka vinyl, started to become common around the 1940s and eventually overtook shellac records around the 1950s or 1960s, depending on the country. Even though vinyl records, cassette tapes, and CDs were much less likely to break during shipping than shellac records, and even though farmers figured out how to ship eggs without breaking them, many record labels continued the practice of paying artists royalties for 90% of net sales until the late 1990s. If a recording contract had a typical breakage clause, and that record label also implemented either the free goods practice described earlier or its 85% of sales substitute, then the artist would receive royalties for no more than 90% of 85% of the physical records sold. 90% of 85% is 76.5%. SRLP-based royalties were typically coupled with a container charge, aka a packaging charge. Based on research I've done, it seems that container charges were supposedly meant to cover the cost of manufacturing the packaging that a record was sold in, such as a sleeve for a vinyl record or jewel case, paper insert, and booklet for a CD. However, these charges were often so excessive that they exceeded the cost of manufacturing the packaging and the cost of manufacturing the physical record as well. Container charges would typically be around 10 to 15% of SRLP for vinyl records, 20% for cassette tapes, and 25% for CDs. In the early days of CDs, the 1980s, it typically cost around $3 to $4 to manufacture a CD, its jewel case, paper insert, and booklet. By the mid-1990s, however, those manufacturing costs had fallen to well under $1, in which case a container charge of 25% would be excessive, even if the SRLP were $10, and even if the cost of making the disc was meant to be included in the charge. Many record labels have moved from SRLP-based royalties to PPD-based royalties and have removed the container charge. In the past, an artist's royalty was based on sales of vinyl records, and they may receive a reduced royalty rate, in some cases 85% of the basic rate for records sold in a CD format. In some cases, an artist may receive escalations such as 90% or 95% for sales above a certain threshold. I saw an example of such a deduction in a 2005 recording contract, but deductions for CD formats are presumably no longer prevalent in recording contracts made today. I saw a 2009 contract from a related record label that had no such deductions for CDs. However, new recording contracts may still include deductions for formats deemed new configurations. A typical record sale doesn't just trigger a master royalty payment to the artist. It also triggers a mechanical royalty payment to the songwriter, which may be the same person. A mechanical royalty is a type of publishing royalty. Many recording contracts include controlled composition clauses, which limit how much the record label would have to pay in mechanical royalties. Typically, the clause stipulates that a record label only has to pay a per-song mechanical royalty rate that is only 75% of the minimum statutory rate, and they won't have to pay more than 10 songs worth of mechanical royalties per album, even if the album has more than 10 songs. There were often additional aspects to a controlled composition clause. I made a video where I explain controlled composition clauses further. Cross-collateralization occurs when a music contract groups the revenue, expenses, and debt from one source with the revenue, expenses, and debt of another source. The sources may include albums of sound recordings, or in the case of a 360 deal, musical works on the publishing side, merchandising, endorsements, or touring. In the vast majority of cases, cross-collateralization is bad for the artist. Here is an example. An artist gets a $100,000 advance for album 1 and a $100,000 advance for album 2. The first album only recoups $50,000 and the second album recoups $125,000. If the albums were not cross-collateralized, then they would be treated as two separate sources. The artist would receive no additional royalties for album 1, but they would receive $25,000 in additional royalties for album 2. If the albums were cross-collateralized, then they would be treated as one source with a $200,000 advance and only $175,000 recouped. So the artist would receive no additional royalties unless they recouped an additional $25,000. If an artist is negotiating a 360 deal that would grant a company recording, publishing, and ancillary entertainment rights, the artist should ensure that those three groups are not cross-collateralized with each other. Otherwise, they might end up in a situation where, for example, their merch revenue is pocketed by the company to make up for an unrecouped album advance.